Hey guys, what's good? It's the Tominator, and we got another bodybuilding throwback here, a vintage review of the 1991 Mr. Olympia. And here's a fun fact, this was the last time the Olympia event was held in Orlando, Florida, at least until it was relocated there in 2020 due to the pandemic. So in a way, we've come full circle, I guess. Anyway, this boiled down to a two-man show, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, an epic clash between two of the all-time greats, with newcomer Dorian Yates challenging the reigning champ Lee Haney for the first and last time. It's a shame we never got to see a rematch in 1992 with an improved version of Dorian. Would Haney have been able to withstand that onslaught and make the necessary adjustments to hold on and secure a 9th title? Unfortunately, we'll never know. But as far as this matchup is concerned, there was a surprising amount of pictures available for a contest that took place 30 years ago, with multiple looks at all the mandatories. Which is great because it makes my life a lot easier and provides the basis for a more sound and thorough review. So this video footage here might be fun to watch, but it wasn't too useful for comparing since the camera was constantly shifting around and moving all over the place. Shoddy camera work in an Olympia, go figure, eh? They've been mucking it up for 3 decades and running. Now, there might be a couple of freeze frames in there worth analyzing, but for the most part, the still photos are a better source, so that's what we're going to go with this time. But before we dive into the pose-by-pose breakdown, I wanted to take a minute to point out that this year's Olympia scoring was broken up into 3 rounds. The Symmetry Round, the Muscularity Round, and the Posing Round. Okay, so the Symmetry Round is where they go through the quarter turns, the Muscularity Round is the mandatory comparisons, and the Posing Round, I believe, is the individual posing routines, although it also might have been the top 6 pose down. They generally don't judge that, but I'm not sure how it worked back then, as the standards have evolved over time. Anyway, the bottom line is that Lee Haney won the Symmetry and Posing rounds, but Dorian Yates actually won the Muscularity Round, edging him out by a single point, assuming that this webpage can be trusted. I couldn't track down an official scorecard like you see with all the modern-day contests, but this result is confirmed by renowned bodybuilding journalist, the late Peter McGuff, who was there in person to witness it all take place. As an interesting bonus, McGuff also gives his take on who won each pose and why, but we'll check that out at the end and see how it compares to the way I call it. Alright, so without further ado, let's get into it. And we'll start it off with a front relaxed. This has got to go to Haney. His chest is light years ahead of Dorian's, and that will become undeniable as we continue throughout the other poses. His arms are thicker and his taper's more pronounced. That's enough to give him the nod. Yates has a slight advantage downstairs with bigger thighs, and even though it's cut off, we know he's beating Lee when it comes to the calves. I also prefer his abs, although neither of them really excel in that area. But regardless, Haney comfortably wins this shot. In the side relaxed, we don't get a full body view, but based on the upper half, I'd still go with Haney. This one is closer, but once again, Dorian's chest is too flat and lets him down here. Aside from the pecs though, Dorian does look harder, with the more defined triceps and obliques. But Haney had that Arnold-like thickness through the pecs that's just so impressive, especially when paired with that sunken midsection. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a rear relaxed, so onto the front double biceps, where I'm going with Haney, hands down. His upper body outline is practically unbeatable here with that flowing taper and massive biceps. Haney was never known for having spectacular arms, but even so, he's easily outperforming a young Dorian Yates in that regard. Here's a zoomed-in shot where you can really appreciate the difference in size and quality when it comes to the guns. Lee's buys are peaked and separated, and he's even beating Yates in the forearms right now. Dorian looks great through the lats and shoulders, but his chest and arms are a bit undersized, plus his waist looks a little blocky standing next to Haney. Even when we factor in the legs, Dorian still loses. Yes, Yates had the better lower body, and granted, Haney's quads aren't quite as wide when we go side to side, but they're probably more separated. So really, the only body part that Dorian wins outright here is the calves. Onto the front lat spread, and this is where things get interesting. These are two of the best to ever hit the pose. Up until this point, I don't believe anyone had seriously challenged Haney in it. He'd been so dominant. But Dorian's definitely giving him a run for his money. This is one that really depends on the picture, since most of the available photos are taken from off angles and can't be properly judged. This zoomed out look of the top 6 affords the most head-on look, but it's still tough to call. On the one hand, I slightly prefer Haney's upper body because his chest is so much thicker. On the other hand, Yates clearly pulls ahead downstairs now, with the bigger quads and calves. They're basically dead even in terms of the lats and the V-taper. Overall, I'm giving it to Lee, but only by a hair. This one's really neck and neck. I'm somewhat undecided because, like I said, it really depends on which photo you're going by. Based on this shot, I'd go with Yates, but then again, it's not a fair look for Haney. The side chest is thankfully a little easier, but not as much as you'd think considering how much more advanced Haney's chest development was. You can see how shallow Dorian's chest looked, especially the upper part of that near pec, but I actually prefer the way he hits it. Haney really puffed up his ribcage, elevating his pecs in the old school fashion. But in my opinion, it doesn't really work for some reason. It looks too scrunched, almost like he has no neck and his head is perched atop his pecs. Plus, it looks a little too compact with the arms held so tightly against the body like that. His far shoulder and near arm looks smaller than Dorian's now, even though they were not. Here's a full body view which depicts Lee in a more flattering light. He looks a little more relaxed in it now, and I would say he's doing just enough to hang on. On paper, this should have been a blowout based on how badly he smoked him in the side relaxed, at least in terms of the chest. But let's give credit where credit is due. Dorian had an underrated side chest. His pecs were never a strong point, but he displayed great size, thickness, and conditioning from the side. Here's one last look that isn't very useful for comparing, but it's a great shot for Haney and highlights the amazingly beefy calves of the shadow. Also, Vince Taylor over there looks sensational. He was chiseled at this show and ended up taking third. Check out that midsection, the side leg, and the striated deltoid. Very polished looking. Okay, moving on, we come to the back double bi, one of the more contentious poses between these two. But to me, this one proved surprisingly straightforward. Haney takes it. Thicker, wider back, and bigger, more separated arms and shoulders. Really, the only area of the upper body that Dorian's winning is the lower back. Downstairs, Yates pulls ahead, of course, with those honking calves and more defined hamstrings. Haney looks surprisingly respectable in terms of the calves, though, but I never liked his closed-legged stance. I don't think he's doing himself any favors with that, since it makes his legs appear smaller. It looks a little better here, though, and again, Haney is the clear winner upstairs. At this point, his back was still much thicker and bigger than Dorian's. Keep in mind that this was his Olympia debut. It would have been really interesting to see how he'd stack up in 92 with the added muscle. And certainly by 93, he'd be beating this version of Haney. But as far as 1991 is concerned, Haney was just too dominant upstairs. And before we get to the lat spread, here's a little bonus in the form of a Christmas tree shot. I think you gotta go with Yates on this one. The serrated lower lats alone put him ahead, but then there's also the traps, which are now more pronounced, and the ripped hamstrings. Haney looks soft in comparison. The back lat spread is a tough one. Based on this look, I'm leaning towards Dorian. His back shows more detail, and his lower body's clearly superior from the rear. But because of the angle, you can't properly judge them in terms of width. This close-up reveals that Haney's lats were still wider and fuller. Dorian looks almost like a classic physique competitor compared to the juggernaut he would become. It's actually shocking how underwhelming this is. Probably just a bad photo. The lighting certainly isn't helping here. Well, we didn't get a good look at this pose, so I can't confidently award it to either man. I think given that the upper body was fairly close, but the lower body went decisively to Dorian, Yates probably deserved it. The side triceps is one where you'd expect Dorian to clean up, but like the side chest, it's surprisingly close. This is a horrible angle for Yates, but Haney looks almost picture perfect, with the abs flexed and the triceps locked in. This one shows an aesthetic variation with Haney extending his triceps and twisting to showcase the back with that striated lower lat. A pretty ingenious play when the back is your strong point. But Dorian was lethal in his execution. He may not have the mass or thickness here compared to, say, 93, but his arm and shoulder still look huge. His horseshoe is well defined, and he just exudes power in this pose. I think these two picks were actually quite flattering for Lee, who doesn't look as great when you watch him in motion, since he's constantly flitting between poses and never really holding it confidently, so overall I'm giving it to Yates. Finally, we come to the ab and thigh, which was the last pose back then since the most muscular wasn't mandatory, and I think you gotta go with Dorian once again. Better quads and more nicely formed abdominals. I like Lee's upper body here with the massive sweeping lats and dense chest, but downstairs he's getting crushed right now. Here's a better look for Lee where he's really flexing that leading thigh, and okay, I can maybe see an argument for him here. His quads look more defined than Dorian's now, and that taper is pretty awesome, but I'm not crazy about the large gap in the middle of his abs. It throws off his aesthetics. Actually, if we put aside the size element for a second, I think Vince Taylor looks better than either of them. Most defined midsection, and he's got a nice blend of sweep and separation in that leading leg. The trailing one that isn't flexed looks incongruous, however. But between these two, yeah, my vote goes to Dorian. Once again, I love Haney's lat taper with that tiny waist, but he's too top-heavy here. Yates is better balanced and looks a little harder overall with the more pleasing abs and those standout calves. Okay, and just for fun, let's throw in the most muscular. There wasn't really a good comparison shot of Dorian, but I don't think he'd have a prayer in beating Haney this year. Lee was pretty deadly in the crab, and Yates simply didn't have the shoulders or arms to do the shot justice. So in the end, I had Haney coming out on top 4-3. After losing the first 4 compulsories, Dorian mounted a strong comeback by winning the final 3, but as they say, it was too little, too late. I'd say that for the most part, we can agree that Haney took the front double and side chest, and probably the back double too, while Yates took the side triceps and ab and thigh. So I think in the end, it all comes down to the lat spreads. Yates could have easily won this comparison if you award him the front lat spread, which I'm sure many of you would have. And I'm guessing that's how the judges saw it too, since they had Dorian upsetting the champ here. I'd really like a closer look at both the lat spreads, since there was no obvious winner. I kept flipping back and forth depending on the picture. But anyway, here's how magazine journalist Peter McGuff broke it down. As you can see, we mostly agree, but I cannot fathom how he thought the front double biceps could be a draw. To me, that was a clear-cut win for Haney. Bottom line is that the end result was a fair one. Dorian was still too green and underdeveloped, whereas Haney was fully mature and at the height of his powers. This was easily one of the best physiques he ever brought to the stage, and it was a fitting way to go out, surpassing Arnold's Olympia record and riding off into the sunset. A lot of fans today speculate that Haney got scared or could see the writing on the wall and knew his days were numbered. I don't really buy that. Yes, he retired young. I believe he was only 31 here. But back in those days, bodybuilders tended to peak earlier in life and not hang around as long. And let's face it, Lee had already done it all. Like I said, he'd just broken Arnold's record, and that was probably enough in his mind. Why not go out on a high note and on your own terms, rather than continuing to compete, knowing that you'll eventually lose? Now sure, there is something noble about laying it all on the line, even while your body declines and breaks down, but as we've seen with guys like Ronnie Coleman, is it really worth it in the long run? Living in constant pain and agony due to numerous training injuries, looking like a ruined shell of your former self? I don't think so. So while I'm just as disappointed as the rest of you that we never got to see a rematch, I am happy for Haney that he went out on top and in good health. Alright guys, so that's all for this one. Hope you enjoyed, and let me know what you think. This comparison proved to be really compelling, with a couple close calls that could have swung the decision either way, so it was fun to go back and revisit. As always, please leave a like and subscribe for more, but until the next time, this is the Tominator signing off, and I'll be back.